It all started with a letter in my mailbox, or maybe it started long before that, when a group of power-hungry neighbors decided they could bully, shame, and force me into submission. What they didn't know is I wasn't just some quiet old man in a creaky house. I was the one man they should have never underestimated, because when they burned my home to the ground, they thought they were ending a fight. But they started a war. What followed was a slow, calculated takedown of corruption, greed, and arrogance, and you won't believe how deep it goes until we dive in. Let me know where you're tuning in from and what time you're listening. Drop a comment below. I want to hear your stories too. I never imagined that the peaceful life I built for my retirement would be shattered by a woman with a clipboard and a designer smile. After 35 years as a federal judge, I was finally ready to embrace the quiet. I'd spent most of my adult life behind a bench, handing down justice in high-stakes courtrooms, navigating legal gray areas and dangerous defendants. But all that was behind me now. I had traded gavels for garden gloves and subpoenas for sunrises. My home sat at the end of a sleepy cul-de-sac in Northern Virginia, an old stone house that had stood for nearly a century. It wasn't flashy. It didn't need to be. It had character, red cedar shutters I painted myself, creaky porch swings where my late wife used to read, and a flagstone chimney. We built together the summer, after our 35th anniversary. I had no interest in the beige and brick sameness of the new developments popping up like weeds around us. My house was mine, built on memories, not market trends. Each morning, I'd rise at 6, brew a strong cup of black coffee, and settle into the porch swing. The air was cool, the birds were louder than the traffic, and I could almost pretend the world outside didn't exist. I liked it that way. I liked watching the rose bushes bloom, especially the ones my wife had planted. Even now, 5 years since her passing, they bloom strong and full, like her spirit still lived in their roots. But peace is a fragile thing. It started subtly. A car slowing in front of my house. A stranger taking photos. A small white sign I hadn't noticed before, planted on the lawn across the street. This community proudly governed by HOA. I felt something tighten in my chest. That sign wasn't there last week. Then she appeared on a Tuesday morning, just as the sky turned gold. I was on the porch, coffee in hand, when I saw her approaching. Mid-50s maybe, power walking like she owned the pavement, wearing a pale pink tracksuit and holding a manila envelope as if it contained sacred truth. I watched her march up to my mailbox, slide the envelope in, and then linger. She pulled out her phone and began taking photos of my porch, the roses, the shutters. She crouched down, zoomed in, snapped again. Then she looked up, saw me watching, and waved with that fake toothpaste commercial grin. I didn't wave back. Later that day, I opened the envelope. Inside was a glossy brochure with a large heading, "Welcome to the Willow Creek Homeowners Association." It described a newly formed HOA, complete with community guidelines, neighborhood beautification plans, and an invitation to attend their upcoming board meeting. That word invitation was used generously. The tone was less friendly and more expectant. The accompanying documents listed a one-time initiation fee of $7,000, with $400 monthly dues. It also included a mandatory compliance form that made my stomach twist. They wanted me to repaint the shutters to an approved shade of taupe, remove the non-standard chimney structure, replace my wooden porch swing with a neutral metal alternative, and this one hit the hardest tear out the rose garden, labeling it non-native vegetation, prone to excessive overgrowth. I sat there, the papers spread across my kitchen table, stunned. This wasn't a suggestion. It was a warning, dressed up in formal fonts and corporate courtesy. They weren't inviting me, they were informing me. And I knew deep down that saying no would come at a cost. I'd face down hardened criminals, ruthless attorneys, even bomb threats during my years on the bench. But I had never encountered anything quite like the smile of that woman as she photographed my roses. Her name was Veronica Langston, I would later learn. She had moved in 6 months ago, into one of the newly built mini mansions just past the bend. Her house had 4 garage doors and a circular driveway. She'd already appointed herself president of the fledgling HOA and had recruited 6 other homeowners to her cause. Together, they called themselves the Willow Creek Standards Committee. I couldn't decide if that sounded more like a book club or a secret police force. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, I sat out back beside the rose bushes, sipping the rest of my cold coffee. I ran my hand along one of the wooden posts my wife and I installed together. A part of me thought about ignoring the whole thing. Maybe if I just stayed quiet, they'd leave me alone. But another part, the one that spent decades defending the Constitution and upholding the rule of law, stirred with something colder. I knew exactly what this was. It was about control. It was about money. And I also knew something they didn't. I may have been retired, but I was far from defenseless. And if Veronica Langston wanted a fight, she had picked the wrong man. The next morning, I didn't even have a chance to finish my coffee before I saw her again. She was back, marching up the driveway in that same pastel tracksuit, flanked by a man I hadn't seen before, mid-40s, smug, with a Bluetooth earpiece and a clipboard clutched to his chest, like a badge of honor. As I opened the door, she didn't even wait for me to say a word. Mr. Everett, she said brightly, like she was about to offer me a coupon for free landscaping. We just wanted to make sure you had everything you needed to make your decision. I looked at the man beside her, who gave a curt nod and handed me a second set of documents. His name tag read Compliance Advisor. I already have your brochure, I said flatly, not inviting them inside. Oh, that was just the intro packet, she said, her voice tilting into something syrupy and condescending. This is the full compliance package. It includes community standards, upgrade timelines, and, of course, your first month's invoice. We've already voted to waive the late fee if you register before Friday. I stared at the stack of papers in my hand, then back at her. I didn't agree to join, I said. The smile on her face stiffened. Well, not officially, she said, still clinging to her sugar-coated delivery. But since your home falls within the newly formed Willow Creek perimeter, and since the majority of homeowners have already signed on, we've, how do I put this, grandfathered you in. The audacity of that statement almost made me laugh. Grandfathered me into a contract I never signed? She waved a perfectly manicured hand like she was dismissing a child's question. It's standard practice in newly planned communities. You see, when we reorganized the neighborhood zoning and filed with the county, your lot was included in the overlay district. It's all above board. Our attorney, who specializes in HOA law, by the way, says it's perfectly legal. I narrowed my eyes. What you call zoning reorganization, I call predatory annexation. The man beside her cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably. But Veronica never missed a beat. Mr. Everett, we're not trying to be adversarial. We're simply building a future for this community. Property values have already gone up 8% since we announced the HOA. The moment we bring all the homes into compliance, well, let's just say you'll thank us later. Let me be clear, I said, folding my arms. I'm not interested. This house isn't just a structure. It's history. It's memory. My wife and I built it up over 40 years. I'm not replacing red shutters with beige plastic just to appease some spreadsheet. She blinked, clearly unaccustomed to pushback. I understand tradition, believe me. But sometimes, the past holds us back. We need unity, cohesion. We can't have outliers. You understand how that affects the perception of the neighborhood, right? Now the gloves were coming off. I've read your bylaws, I said, lifting the packet. You're charging residents $7,000 just to join, then $400 a month. And that doesn't even cover the mandatory changes. She smiled again, but it didn't reach her eyes. It covers community beautification and enforcement. And who's enforcing it? I interrupted. You? Her expression flickered. The man beside her, still silent, shifted his weight again. Veronica inhaled deeply, then took a step closer. Listen, Judge Everett, I stopped her right there. Just Mr. Everett now. Fine M, Mr. Everett. Let me level with you. Your house is the last non-compliant property on the street. The only one that still has those, let's be honest, eccentric features. People are watching. Potential buyers, developers. We're getting a lot of interest in this area. If we can bring it all under one clean vision, this neighborhood becomes one of the most desirable spots in the county. And if I say no, I asked. She hesitated. Then, softly, with a smile that no longer even tried to hide its menace, she said, "Things have a way of getting difficult for outliers. Code inspections, citations. It's amazing how quickly little issues can snowball into larger problems." I stared at her, heart rate steady. I had heard threats far more veiled than this, in federal courtrooms from people with much more to lose. But none of them had dared to do it with a smile and a pink scarf. "Are you threatening me, Mrs. Langston?" "Oh, no," she said sweetly, tilting her head. "I'm trying to protect you from yourself." Without another word, I stepped back inside and closed the door. They stood on my porch for another moment. I heard muffled whispers, then footsteps retreating. I stood behind the door for a long while, listening to the silence, feeling something cold and electric settle into my bones. They weren't bluffing. This wasn't just about shutters or paint. They wanted this house, and they didn't care how they got it. But what they didn't know was this. I'd dealt with people like them before. People who dressed up greed as progress, who called intimidation policy. I knew how to read between the lines, and I knew how to hit back with precision. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. They didn't waste any time. The day after I declined their invitation, I stepped out onto my porch to find a neon orange notice taped to my door. It was stamped with an official-looking logo that read Willow Creek Standards Committee and titled Non-Compliance Warning. The offense? Visual disruption due to excessive color contrast. They were referring to my red cedar shutters. I almost laughed. Almost. But that notice was just the beginning. 2 days later, another one appeared, this time citing my mailbox, which apparently lacked uniformity with the new neighborhood design aesthetic. Never mind that I'd hand-carved it 20 years ago, and that it matched my home's natural wood trim. According to them, it now disrupted visual flow. Then came the grass. I mow every Saturday, always have. But one morning I caught a woman I'd never seen before squatting at the edge of my lawn with a tape measure. I watched her through the window as she stood, scribbled something into a small notepad, and walked off without a word. That afternoon I found another violation. Notice grass height exceeds approved maximum by 1.5 inches. This wasn't enforcement. This was a campaign. It wasn't just the notices. Things began happening. Subtle things. My garbage cans were rolled into the middle of the road twice in 1 week. A rock accidentally shattered one of my side garden lights. On another morning, I opened my front door to find a half-eaten sandwich shoved into my mailbox. I wasn't sure if that one was part of the HOA's official harassment strategy or just a bored teenager, but it all added up. And then came the watchers. I'd step out to check the mail and feel it, that sense of being watched. Curtains would shift in windows. A man I didn't know would just happen to be walking by my yard, staring a little too long. People the first once waved to now looked away. It felt like the whole neighborhood was slowly turning its back. I went to the county records office to confirm what I already suspected. There was no legal requirement for me to join the HOA. My home was part of the original subdivision that predated their little empire, but legality had never stopped power-hungry people from trying to push boundaries. I printed copies of my deed, the zoning maps, even the grandfathering exemption, and placed them in a folder by the door. Still, they escalated. One Saturday morning around 6:45 a.m., I woke to the sound of leaf blowers roaring just beneath my bedroom window. I staggered outside in my robe and slippers, only to find a landscaping crew trimming shrubs along the sidewalk in front of my house. I hadn't hired them, but there they were, machines blaring and clippings flying. "Who sent you?" I asked the crew chief, yelling over the sound. "HOA directive," he shouted back with a shrug. "Weekly maintenance rotation." I told him I was not a member and had never authorized service. He looked uncomfortable, then gestured at a clipboard with an order signed by the committee. They left, reluctantly, but not before one of the workers muttered, "Good luck, man." It was becoming psychological warfare. That same week, I noticed small lawn flags appearing along my front property line. At first, I thought they were for underground utilities, but they were color-coded and far too precise. I later learned they were part of the HOA's Curbside Uniformity Initiative, meant to visually prepare lots for future upgrades. Meaning, when I finally broke, they began holding HOA board meetings in Veronica's driveway, just across from mine. Her house had become a kind of operations center, complete with printed banners, matching lawn chairs, and even a podium. From my office window, I could hear snippets of conversation, talk of increasing property unity, complaints about eyesores, whispers about problem homes. I was always that house, that one holdout, the lone nail sticking out of their perfect plank. They made a show of ignoring me, too polite to say anything directly, but loud enough for me to hear. On one occasion, I heard Veronica say, "It's a shame when someone refuses to evolve. It makes you wonder if they're even fit to live in a neighborhood like this." I didn't rise to it. I documented everything, every notice, every violation, every odd occurrence. I had a folder thick enough to file a lawsuit, but I wasn't ready to go public just yet. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the breeze carried the smell of fresh-cut grass, I noticed a couple walking their golden retriever past my front yard. The dog suddenly trotted into my flower bed, squatted, and did its business right on my wife's roses. The couple paused, glanced around, then started to walk away. I stepped onto the porch. "Excuse me," I said calmly. "Your dog left something behind." The woman turned, gasped theatrically. "Oh no! Bentley would never. He's so well trained he must be sick or scared or—" "I have it on camera," I said, pointing to the security light mounted above the garage. The man said nothing, just pulled the leash a little tighter and walked faster. That's when I knew this wasn't just about compliance. This was about pressure, isolation, bullying. And it wasn't just a few neighbors, it was a system, one they had built to wear people down. But what they didn't know, what they still hadn't figured out, was that I didn't wear down. I build cases. I build timelines. I document. I record. And I wait. They had declared war on the wrong man. It was just after midnight when I first saw them. I had always been a light sleeper, an occupational habit, after decades of getting urgent phone calls from law clerks, prosecutors, or the occasional death threat. That night, I woke up with a strange unease in my chest, the kind you can't explain but know better than to ignore. I got up to grab a glass of water, passing by the kitchen window, when a flicker of movement caught my eye. 3 figures stood near the edge of my backyard, just inside the property line. They were using flashlights, pointed down low, careful not to alert anyone, or so they thought. I recognized the outline of Veronica right away. She had a particular way of standing hands on hips, head tilted slightly to the left, like she was appraising a painting she didn't quite approve of. Next to her was that same clipboard guy from before, and a third man I didn't recognize. All 3 of them were wearing dark clothes and baseball caps. In their hands were tape measures, a level, and what looked like a set of plastic markers, little orange flags used to outline boundaries. I quietly turned off the kitchen light and watched them from the shadows. They were whispering, pointing toward my fence posts, then down toward the flower beds. Veronica crouched, stuck a flag in the ground, and made a note. They weren't just wandering. They were planning. I turned on my porch light. Instantly, their heads snapped up like deer caught in a spotlight. I opened the door and stepped outside, holding my phone up and recording. "Evening," I said flatly. Veronica straightened, dusting off her knees like she hadn't just been trespassing. "Oh, Judge, sorry. I mean, Mr. Everett," she said, too quickly. "We were just doing a late-night inspection." "In my yard?" I raised an eyebrow. "On private property?" She gave a tight smile. "We had a complaint about invasive roots crossing into common space, and we thought it best to get a head start. HOA protocol, you understand." "I'm not part of your HOA," I replied calmly, camera still rolling. "And this land isn't common space. It's privately owned and clearly marked." The man with the clipboard stepped forward. "We were just identifying potential encroachment issues." "You're encroaching right now," I said. "That's a legal term, by the way. Want me to define it for you?" He took a step back. That's when the third man spoke, deep voice, confident. "Now there's no need to get hostile. We're just here to make sure things are safe and orderly. Nobody wants trouble." He wasn't wearing a name tag, but I recognized his face. Bob Langston, Veronica's husband. I'd heard whispers that he was a retired police sergeant, and from the way he carried himself, I believed it. But he wasn't there to keep the peace. He was there to intimidate. I turned my phone toward him, planning to report this to your old buddies on the force, Bob. He stared at the camera, jaw clenched, then looked away. Veronica stepped forward again, reclaiming the lead role in their little theater performance. "We just want to help you bring your home into alignment," she said. "And frankly, Mr. Everett, you're the only one making this difficult." "I'm preserving a historic property," I replied. "The law protects that. You might want to look it up. There are also safety concerns," she countered. "Those old fences are splintering. Your electrical box is rusted. It wouldn't take much for a fire, too." She stopped herself, but the implication hung heavy in the air. I lowered my phone, walked closer, and looked her dead in the eyes. "Are you threatening to burn my house down, Veronica?" Her smile didn't waver, but the others shifted uncomfortably. "Of course not. That would be," she let out a small laugh, "insane. I'm just worried about you. Old homes can be unpredictable." "Get off my property," I said, stepping aside and pointing toward the front gate. "And next time you trespass, you won't just be dealing with a camera. You'll be dealing with a courtroom." They left without another word, walking quickly down the side path and disappearing into the dark like raccoons caught in a trash can. I stood there for a long time after they were gone, heart beating fast but hands steady. I knew the look in Bob Langston's eyes, that quiet calculation. He'd been law enforcement long enough to know how to lean without leaving bruises. And Veronica? She wasn't just a busybody with a Pinterest addiction. She was organized, manipulative, and clearly used to getting her way. But this wasn't her neighborhood to run. I spent the next day checking every square inch of my yard. I found 3 more little orange flags stuck behind bushes, and 2 fresh scrapes on my back fence. I didn't touch anything. I documented it all, saved the footage, and filed it away. They were trying to provoke me, to bait me into acting rashly so they could call me unstable, combative, whatever it took to paint me as the problem. But I didn't survive decades on the bench by losing my temper. I wasn't going to lose this war by acting like a fool. They had made their move. Now it was my turn to prepare mine. They crossed the line 5 days later. I had just returned from the local VFW breakfast, one of the few places left where people still shook hands like they meant it. As I pulled into the driveway, I noticed something strange. The front gate was ajar. Not wide open, but cracked just enough to make me pause. I always locked it. Always. The moment I stepped into the backyard, my heart sank. My wife's rose garden, what was left of it, looked like a battlefield. Bushes had been ripped out by the roots. Soil had been churned like someone had tried to till it with a dull blade. The trellises, which once held cascading clusters of white and crimson blooms, were snapped in half. Pieces of them lay scattered across the lawn like driftwood. I dropped everything I was holding. The grocery bag I'd picked up on the way home tumbled to the grass, eggs cracking against the dirt. I didn't care. I dropped to my knees and ran my hands through the soil. The stems weren't broken naturally, these were cut, jagged, forced. Someone had gone at them with shears or worse. Some of the rose bushes were dying right in front of me. their leaves curling, their color already fading. The smell of herbicide was faint, but it was there. I couldn't breathe. That garden wasn't just flowers. It was her. Every plant had a story. We'd planted them together the year she was diagnosed. She chose each variety by name: Eternal Flame, Queen Elizabeth, Peace. She'd made me promise to care for them after she was gone. And I had, for 5 years. Through every frost, every storm, I had never missed a day. Until now. I stood up slowly, hands trembling with rage. I turned on my heels, stormed into the house, and pulled up the security footage. The cameras I'd installed caught everything. The grainy black and white image showed 3 figures entering the yard just after 2 a.m. They weren't even trying to be stealthy this time. Veronica was leading them, still wearing her trademark silk pajama set and a baseball cap pulled low over her hair. She carried a large spray tank on her back, the kind used by professional exterminators. One of the other 2 was Bob Langston. The third was the clipboard guy, again Caleb, I later learned. They moved with purpose, like they'd rehearsed. Veronica sprayed the rose bushes methodically. Caleb followed behind, snapping pictures, while Bob kept watch. At one point, Bob turned and looked directly at the camera. He smiled. I pressed pause and stared at the image for a long time. Then I saved it, copied it to 3 drives, printed the stills, backed them up to the cloud. I'd lost count of how many times I'd warned them. This wasn't just harassment anymore. It was destruction of property, intentional, documented. But more than that, it was personal. I stepped outside just as the sun began to set. The garden looked like a war memorial. The air still carried that sour chemical smell. I could barely stand to look at it. So instead, I turned my gaze toward Veronica's house. She was on her porch, sipping something out of a tall glass and laughing with one of her board members. I walked across the lawn, not bothering to go around. I marched straight to the edge of her property and stood there until she noticed me. When she did, her smile faltered. "We need to talk," I said. She set her glass down and came to the top step. "If this is about those roses," she said, "I'm sorry, but several neighbors complained about the smell. And the thorns, honestly, they're a liability." "They were on my property," I replied, "inside my fence. There's some disagreement about that. Property lines can be, don't." I cut her off. "I have the deed, the survey, the footage. I know what you did." Her eyes narrowed. "You're being awfully dramatic, Mr. Everett. Those roses were planted by my wife 50 years ago, and you killed them." She shifted on her feet. "If you joined the HOA, this could have been handled properly. You're the one choosing to be difficult." Bob appeared behind her, arms crossed. "We were just trying to help the neighborhood," he said. "Keep things tidy. You trespassed. You vandalized my property. And now you're trying to justify it by calling it tidying up?" Bob stepped forward slightly. "Now, let's not escalate things. No need to involve the authorities over a few bushes." I laughed just once, cold and sharp. "The authorities? That's rich. You think I'm afraid of involving the law? You think I won't press charges?" Veronica gave a tight smile. "If you do, Mr. Everett, I'm afraid things will only get more complicated. For everyone." There it was again, the threat behind the smile, that passive-aggressive poison she coated every sentence with. I stared at them both for a long moment. Then I turned and walked back toward my house without another word. That night, I didn't sleep. I stayed up cataloging every violation, every video file, every threat. I started cross-referencing footage. I began writing names, timelines, patterns. It was time to stop reacting and start preparing. They thought they'd pushed me to the edge. They had no idea. They hadn't pushed me to the edge. They'd pushed me into action. The fire started just before dawn. It was a Thursday morning, gray, cool, the kind of morning where everything feels a little too quiet. I was at the courthouse, of all places. Old habits die hard, I suppose. A friend of mine, Judge Milton, had invited me to sit in on a corruption case. I wasn't wearing robes anymore, But sometimes I like to be close to the rhythm of justice. It reminded me who I was before all this started. We were just wrapping the morning session when Emily, Milton's clerk, burst through the double doors of the courtroom, her face pale as parchment. "Mr. Everett," she called, eyes wide and voice trembling. "Your house, it's on fire." I stood up so fast, I nearly knocked over the bench behind me. "What?" "Fire department called it in. Massive blaze." "Your neighbor across the street, Miss S. Watson," she called 911. The courtroom vanished around me. I didn't wait for Milton to speak. I was already halfway down the marble steps before he could offer to drive. It took me exactly 15 minutes to reach my street. It felt like an eternity. I saw the smoke before I turned the corner, thick, black, and angry. It curled into the sky like a fist, raised in victory. My tires screeched as I pulled up behind a row of flashing red lights and fire trucks, their crews shouting orders, dragging hoses, blasting water through shattered windows. My home, my history was burning. The cedar shutters had already curled from the heat. Flames were licking up the porch posts, devouring the swing my wife had loved so much. The flagstone chimney we built together was now cracked down the middle. Fire poured from the roof, and I could hear the wooden beams inside groaning under the weight of the blaze, like the house was crying out in pain. I stepped toward the perimeter, but a firefighter stopped me with an arm outstretched. His helmet read Martinez. "Sir, you can't be here. It's not safe. It's my house." He recognized me then. His face changed sympathy mixed with a touch of shame. "We're doing everything we can, but this fire is moving fast. These old places, wiring, dry wood, it doesn't take much." "My wiring was inspected last month," I said. Everything was cleared. He didn't respond. I scanned the crowd. Neighbors had gathered at a distance, their mouths covered in shock or whispers. Then I saw her standing on her porch across the street, holding a steaming cup of coffee. Veronica Langston. She was dressed like she always was at that hour: leggings, a fleece pullover, hair perfectly twisted into a bun, calm, smiling, like she was watching a performance. Her phone was in her hand, and she was showing someone a photo, pointing toward my burning house. Next to her stood Caleb and Bob, both murmuring to each other like nothing was out of the ordinary. I felt my jaw tighten until I thought I'd crack a molar. I turned away and pulled out my phone, fingers shaking. I tapped into my security app. Nothing loaded. A blank screen. I tried again, then again. All my cameras, every single one, had gone offline at exactly 3:02 a.m. The fire was reported just after 7. I stood there, surrounded by smoke, heat, and the acrid sting of history being erased. And I knew this wasn't random. This wasn't an accident. It was the kill shot. The culmination of everything they had done. The inspections, the trespassing, the chemical sabotage, the coordinated harassment. It had all led to this moment. They wanted the house gone, and now it was. But they made one critical mistake. They thought the fire would break me. What it did was solidify me. When the last flames were out and the roof had finally collapsed, I walked through the ashes. A firefighter handed me a charred piece of wood, part of the porch trim, burned nearly black but still holding a hint of its former red. I held it like a relic, like a fragment of bone from someone I loved. That night, I didn't sleep. I didn't cry. I didn't pace the floors of some rented hotel room. I made phone calls. One to my old friend at the FBI's Public Corruption Division, one to a former colleague at the state attorney's office, and one to a private investigator named Ruth Delgado, one of the best in the business, and someone I'd trusted with more than a few sensitive matters in my former life. By morning, I had a task force. Veronica must have sensed something was shifting. The next day, she had the audacity to swing by what was left of my property. She stood just outside the caution tape, sipping her coffee again. "This is so tragic," she said, not even bothering to sound convincing. "You know, if you just complied with HOA safety standards." Well, we might have been able to prevent this. I didn't reply. She smiled wider, smug. Maybe this is a chance to rebuild something more modern. We could help you fast-track the process if you decided to. You might want to keep your distance, I said. Investigators will be combing through every inch of this. Her lips twitched, but she didn't flinch. You do what you have to do, Mr. Everett. We all grieve in our own ways. She turned and walked off, her ponytail bouncing behind her like a whip. Over the next week, Ruth dug deep. I handed her everything I had. The footage, the notices, the timeline, the burned-out hard drives. She didn't hesitate. She had a nose for corruption, and this wasn't her first HOA mess. Meanwhile, the first stayed quiet. Let them believe I was licking my wounds. I was doing nothing of the sort. The insurance company sent an adjuster. I handed him a folder with a certified electrical inspection dated 6 days before the fire, a video of my last walk through time-stamped logs from the surveillance system, and the sudden blackout at 3:02 a.m. He looked over the folder and said, "Sir, I think we may be looking at arson." I already knew that. 3 days later, Ruth called. "I've got something," she said. She had pulled county fire records for the last 5 years. In that time, 9 homes in our zip code had caught fire under suspicious but inconclusive circumstances. All 9 belonged to homeowners who had initially refused to join Willow Creek HOA. All 9 were later sold to the same shell company, one registered to a Delaware LLC. The listed manager? Karen Properties, Incorporated. Veronica Langston's maiden name was Karen Avery. They weren't just pushing people out, they were erasing them, burning their homes to the ground, buying the land for pennies, then reselling it to developers for a massive profit. I looked out at what remained of my house, the blackened foundation, the scorched brick, the twisted metal railings, and felt something settle in my bones. This was bigger than revenge. This was justice. And justice, unlike fire, doesn't burn fast. It burns slow and clean. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Up until that point, I had kept my identity out of it. Retired or not, I knew better than to lead with former federal judge when arguing over garbage cans and rose bushes. People react differently when they know what you used to be. Some get deferential, others get defensive, but most just get slippery. But now it was time to let the truth come out. For months, they had treated me like an easy target, a stubborn old man in a historic house, too set in his ways, too proud to join their little club. They saw me as a bump in their blueprint, a speed bump, a soft one. They didn't know that before I ever planted a rose bush or painted a shutter, I sat on the bench of the U.S. District Court. That I'd presided over organized crime cases, corporate fraud, racketeering, political corruption. That I'd written rulings that rattled CEOs and sentenced cartel associates to federal prison. That people used to whisper my name in courthouse hallways like a warning. My name is Thomas Everett, and for 3 decades, I was known by attorneys and defendants alike as the Hammer. I didn't give myself that nickname. A federal prosecutor did, during a press conference after a major racketeering conviction. "Judge Everett doesn't just bring the gavel," he said. "He brings the hammer." It stuck. I never liked it. I always thought the law should be precise, not brutal. But today, I wasn't aiming for precision. I was aiming to break something wide open. I sat in my temporary office, just a folding table, and an old laptop inside a rented trailer on my property, and reviewed what Ruth Delgado had sent me. Property deeds, LLC filings, campaign contributions, county rezoning records. It was all starting to form a pattern, a clear one, too perfect to be coincidence. Every house that refused to join the HOA had experienced some form of harassment. And if the homeowner held out long enough, a fire, then a lowball sale, then silence. It was organized. It was calculated, and it had all the markings of a criminal conspiracy. What I needed now was confirmation, something damning. something no one could explain away. That's when I made my fourth phone call, the one I'd been saving. I reached out to an old colleague, now a lead investigator at the Point Use Attorney's office. We'd worked together years ago on a mortgage fraud ring that spanned 4 states. He answered on the second ring. "Tom?" he said, surprised. "Didn't expect to hear from you again." I told him everything, not as a neighbor, not as a victim, but as a fellow legal mind laying out the bones of a case. By the time I was done, he was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "You might have a RICO case on your hands." That one word, RICO, sent a chill through me. The Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. It wasn't something you used lightly. But if you could prove that a group of people had conspired together to commit repeated criminal acts like vandalism, arson, and fraud under the banner of a shared organization, well, then you had something powerful. I agreed to gather more, quietly, discreetly. The last thing I wanted was to spook them before I had everything in place. So I kept playing the part, kept nodding politely when Veronica waved across the street, kept listening when HOA members mumbled apologies for all the confusion, kept acting like the man they thought they'd broken. But at night, I built a case. I wasn't just going to fight back. I was going to bury them. I spent the next 2 weeks buried in evidence. Every letter, every violation notice, every piece of HOA propaganda I digitized, indexed, and dated it. I reviewed every minute of surviving security footage from before the fire, carefully reconstructing the timeline. I met with Ruth almost daily, both of us poring over county property records like forensic accountants. We built a wall of documents on the inside of my rented trailer, printouts of LLC ownership chains, hand-drawn maps, city zoning proposals, and photographs of fire-damaged homes. The deeper we dug, the more sickeningly clear the pattern became. The HOA had a formula. Step 1. Identify older, non-compliant homes, usually the ones that didn't match their beige and brick cookie-cutter vision. Step 2. Harass the homeowners with endless citations, neighbor complaints, and noise disruptions. Step 3. Escalate to vandalism or direct damage. Step 4. After the owner was exhausted, financially or emotionally, swoop in with a conveniently timed offer from a mysterious investment group. And finally, once acquired, Step 5. Flip the property to a developer or use it to lobby for reasoning, pocketing massive profit. They'd done it 6 times on my street alone, 11 times in the adjacent neighborhood, all under the radar, all within policy. On paper, the HOA was just maintaining community standards. In practice, it was a racketeering operation masquerading as lawn patrol, and all roads led back to Karen Properties Incorporated, registered in Delaware and operated out of a UPS store mailbox. The real owner, Veronica Langston's sister-in-law. That connection, while damning, wasn't enough on its own. People hide behind shell companies all the time. I needed more, something undeniable, something that would make a jury sit up and lean forward. That's when Ruth made contact with a woman named Sophia Morales. She was listed as the former treasurer of the Willow Creek HOA, though her name had disappeared from the website shortly before my fire. Ruth tracked her down 2 towns over, working at a small cafe off the highway. At first, Sophia was hesitant, nervous. But after some reassurance and a quiet meeting in the back booth of that cafe, she agreed to talk. Her hands trembled as she slid a USB drive across the table. She wouldn't speak until I'd tucked it into my pocket. Then, in a quiet voice, she told us everything. Veronica had brought her on early in the HOA's formation, promising community service hours that would help Sophia qualify for a teaching credential. But soon, things shifted. She was asked to adjust budgets, to leave out certain line items, to mark checks as maintenance that had nothing to do with landscaping or repairs. When Sophia protested, Veronica threatened to report her undocumented status. She said I owed her, Sophia whispered, tears in her eyes, for the opportunity, for not turning me in. She made me feel like I had no choice. The USB drive held 5 years of HOA financials, including scanned invoices, off-the-book transactions, and a folder of internal emails. In those emails, Veronica and her board discussed problem homes, planned enforcement actions, and even joked about finding creative solutions to deal with stubborn owners. There were direct references to me. One email from Bob 2 weeks before the fire read, "Everett's cameras are everywhere. We'll have to kill the power first. Karen's guy can handle it." Another from Veronica said, "Once that place goes up, we can finally unify the block." I read those words over and over. Once that place goes up, it wasn't just a theory anymore. It was premeditated. Now I had what I needed. Ruth handed off the files to the Point Use Attorney's office. My friend there confirmed what I already knew: they were pursuing this as a RICO case. The moment they had a little more confirmation, one recording, one witness willing to wear a wire, it would all move forward. That recording came from Sophia. She agreed to meet with Veronica one last time, under the pretense of asking for her old treasurer job back. The FBI wired her up. She walked into Veronica's home wearing a floral sundress and a nervous smile, while 2 agents waited in a black SUV down the street. The recording was everything we hoped for and more. Veronica bragged about the upcoming redevelopment phase, laughed about which house we should deal with next, and even mentioned that Bob's contacts on the force are still looking out for us. She called the fire unfortunate but necessary. And when Sophia asked what would happen if someone talked, Veronica responded, "Then we make sure they don't talk again." By the time Sophia left the house, she was pale and shaking, but she had delivered the final nail in the coffin. The DOJ moved quickly after that. Subpoenas were issued. Financial accounts were frozen. Wiretap approvals came down within 48 hours. Investigators began conducting quiet interviews with other former HOA members and homeowners who had sold under suspicious circumstances. One man, Mr. Patel, broke down crying in front of a federal agent, describing how his father's ashes were lost in a garage fire just days after he refused to join the HOA. Another woman, Mrs. Rodriguez, shared photos of her charred wedding album, still wrapped in the melted metal of a filing cabinet. I helped coordinate the interviews, anonymously at first. I wasn't ready to come forward publicly, not yet, but behind the scenes, I worked with the DOJ every day, helping shape the case, providing context, identifying HOA board members in blurry surveillance stills. All the while, Veronica kept smiling. She held meetings. She passed out flyers. She even filed a petition to have my burned-out home declared a community hazard so she could clean up the street. It was like watching a train barrel toward a cliff while the conductor sipped champagne. Every smug gesture, every staged photo with realtors, every "oh, what a shame," she muttered when tourists stopped to look at the ruins of my house, I documented it. I added it to the folder. I built the timeline like I'd done hundreds of times before, methodically, unemotionally, relentlessly. By the time we were done, it wasn't just a case. It was a story of greed disguised as governance, of intimidation dressed up as policy, a story that a jury wouldn't just understand but feel deeply. The best part? Veronica still had no idea it was me pulling the strings behind the scenes. She thought I was grieving, broken, beaten. Let her think that, because I wasn't building a home anymore. I was building a reckoning, and every nail, every brick, every word in that case file, it was for her. The air inside the community center was thick with self-importance and lemon-scented disinfectant. Folded chairs lined the walls, most filled with familiar neighborhood faces, some curious, some skeptical, many quietly complicit. They'd all been invited to the Willow Creek HOA Emergency General Assembly, called under Article 14 of their bylaws, which allowed for accelerated redevelopment action on properties deemed unsightly or hazardous. My property, of course, was first on the agenda. I stood outside in the parking lot for a long time, watching through the tall glass windows. Veronica was at the front of the room, standing behind a collapsible podium like a queen preparing for a royal address. She wore one of her signature pantsuits, navy blue with pearl buttons, her blonde hair twisted into a bun so tight it looked like it could snap under pressure. To her right sat Caleb with a laptop and Bob Langston, arms crossed, chewing on a toothpick like he was still on patrol. Behind them was a projector screen, already glowing with the title slide, Willow Creek Reimagined, a community revitalization initiative. I knew what came next. They'd present photos of my burned-out home, talk about its negative impact on property values, show mock-ups of a new beige townhouse with matching hedges and approved features. Then, they'd vote to reclaim the land under some twisted clause they'd buried in their fake charter. What they didn't know was that I wasn't just there to object, I was there to end them. I adjusted the wire taped beneath my collar and stepped inside. Heads turned, conversations stilled, chairs shifted. I could hear the small intake of breath as someone recognized me. Veronica's smile faltered just for a second. Then she recovered, projecting sweetness over steel. "Well, Mr. Everett," she said, "you made it. I was just telling everyone how we need to move forward together as a neighborhood. I'm so glad you came." I walked to the center aisle slowly, deliberately, the way I used to walk into court when I knew I was holding a winning motion. "I'd like to speak," I said calmly. Veronica exchanged a quick glance with Bob. Then she turned back, voice syrupy. "I'm sorry, but this is a board-led session. Homeowners may submit written comments after the, I believe, Section 9.3 of your own bylaws allows a property owner listed on the agenda to speak prior to board deliberation." I interrupted. She blinked. The room fell quiet. I stepped to the front and placed a thick file folder on the podium beside her laptop. "I've prepared my comments." I opened the folder and began laying out photos, grainy security footage, maps with redacted addresses, highlighted transaction records. "These are photos from my security cameras," I said. "This one shows Veronica and two board members entering my yard without consent at 2:13 a.m., 2 days before the fire. Here's another Bob Langston photographing my electrical box. And here, this one's my favorite Caleb loosening fence posts under the guise of measuring easements." There were gasps from the crowd. Veronica's smile had disappeared completely. "None of that proves anything," she said, voice sharp now, the veneer cracking. "You're just throwing around accusations without context." "Oh, there's context," I said, pulling out another stack. "Here are wire transfers from Karen Properties Incorporated, a shell company owned by your sister-in-law. Every time a house burned or sold under duress, they acquired the deed. Then, within a month, that property was flipped to developers for 3 to 5 times the purchase price." Murmurs were rising around the room. People were shifting in their seats. A few even stood up. Veronica stepped forward. "You have no legal standing. This is defamation. Slander. This is evidence," I said, and reached back into my bag. Out came my judicial robe. I shook it loose, slowly, letting the heavy black fabric settle over my shoulders like armor. The room went silent. "My name," I said, slipping my arms into the sleeves, "is Thomas Everett. I'm a retired federal judge, formerly of the United States District Court. I have presided over hundreds of cases, including organized crime, racketeering, and real estate fraud. I know the law, and I know what you've been doing." Veronica looked like she'd been slapped. "This is a stunt," she hissed. "You can't just walk in here and accuse people." "I'm not accusing," I said. "I'm presenting. And so is the point, us Department of Justice." At that cue, the double doors at the back of the room opened. 2 men and a woman entered, wearing dark jackets with bold yellow letters on the back. FBI. They moved quickly. One went to Caleb. Another approached Bob, who instinctively reached toward his belt-old habit but stopped when he realized just how outnumbered he was. Veronica backed into the wall, shaking her head. "You can't do this. You don't understand. I was trying to protect the neighborhood. I was preserving property values." "By burning down homes?" I asked. "By intimidating residents into selling for pennies?" By using your own HOA as a front for real estate profiteering? No. No, she whispered. You don't get it. This was all above board. This was progress. One of the agents stepped beside her, reading her rights with slow, clear authority. Her eyes darted between the papers I'd left on the podium and the badge inches from her face. Then, her coffee mug, the same one she sipped from the morning my house burned, slipped from her hand and shattered on the floor. Bob tried to make a break for the side exit, but he didn't make it 3 steps before being tackled to the ground. I stood there and watched, feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not satisfaction, exactly. Not joy. Just a deep, enduring sense that balance had been restored. Justice, slow and heavy, had finally arrived. The room erupted in cheers, real ones. Neighbors who had stayed silent for months now clapped, shouted, cried. Mrs. Johnson from across the street came over and hugged me, trembling with relief. I thought they were going to burn my house too, she said. I'm so sorry I didn't say anything earlier. You don't need to apologize, I said gently. They counted on your silence. That's how they operated. But they won't anymore. Veronica and her board were led out in handcuffs, past the very neighbors they'd bullied for years. Caleb refused to make eye contact. Bob spat on the floor as they passed. Veronica tried to hold her head high, but it was no use. The Queen of Willow Creek had been dethroned. Afterward, I gathered my materials, folded my robe, and tucked it back into my briefcase. The weight of it felt different now, lighter maybe. I stayed behind to help stack chairs, chat with neighbors, listen to stories I hadn't heard before. Tales of threats, vandalism, manipulation. The pattern had been there all along. We just needed the right moment to expose it. And as I left the building, walking into the crisp evening air, someone tapped my shoulder. It was Sophia, the former treasurer who'd worn the wire. She looked nervous, then smiled. I saw it all. You did it. No, I said. You did. She looked down. I'm scared of what happens next. I placed a hand on her shoulder. You were brave. That matters. And you're not alone. As I stepped into my car and looked one last time at the community center behind me, I realized something else. This fight wasn't just about me or my house. It was about every person who's ever been made to feel small in their own home. Every neighbor afraid to speak up. Every widow told to cut down her roses. Every veteran fined for flying a flag. Every family pushed out because their shutters were the wrong color or their porch swing squeaked. Veronica thought she could bury people like that. She forgot one thing. Some of us come back stronger from the fire. 6 months later, I stood in my garden with a coffee cup in hand, watching the sunrise over fresh purple trim. The house had been rebuilt piece by piece, not by contractors hired from flashy real estate firms, but by local craftsmen, neighbors, friends, and volunteers who believed in what the home had represented. It wasn't just a rebuild, it was a resurrection. Every detail was as it had been before the fire. The cedar shutters painted the exact shade. My wife loved the hand-carved porch swing replicated from photos, and most importantly, the rose garden. A single bush had survived the fire barely. Ruth had helped me preserve cuttings, and with care, love, and a little patience, they'd grown back into a new bed of blooms. They weren't just flowers anymore. They were proof that something precious could be destroyed and still return stronger. Veronica Langston and her entire HOA board were behind bars now. 25 years for her, 15 for Bob. Caleb turned state's evidence and got a reduced sentence, but he won't be passing out compliance notices ever again. The courtroom had been packed for the trial. Reporters, neighbors, former homeowners, many who had moved away after falling victim to the same scam returned to testify. They brought photos of lost family homes, ruined keepsakes, insurance battles. Some cried on the stand. Others spoke with trembling fury. But every single one of them helped connect the dots for the jury. The day the verdict was read, I wore my robes one final time, not as a judge, but as a symbol. When the judge presiding over the case offered me the chance to speak as a victim, I declined. I didn't need to say anything. The evidence spoke for itself. The sentence was swift. Just before she was led away, Veronica tried to offer a speech about how she had only wanted to preserve order and protect property values. But the judge cut her off, the way she had cut off so many voices at those HOA meetings. This time, there were no smug smiles, no designer coffee mugs, just shackles and silence. After the trial, the government seized her home and sold it to help pay restitution to her victims. Funny how justice works. A lovely family moved in, immigrants from Ethiopia, I believe. Their children play on the lawn where Veronica once stood with her measuring tape and smartphone. They painted the house yellow. They added a vegetable garden. They invited me over for dinner their first week in. I brought wine. Their youngest daughter brought me a rose from their yard, smiling like she had no idea what that gesture meant to me. We don't have an HOA anymore. We have something better, a real neighborhood association. Not one built on control, but on community. We help each other. We share tools. We mow lawns for the older folks and watch pets during hospital visits. The Patel family hosts monthly barbecues in their backyard. Mrs. Rodriguez started a book club that meets in the new community garden we built on the empty lot that used to house one of Veronica's worst makeover projects. We even have block parties now. Not the kind with HOA banners and surveillance drones. Real parties, with potluck tables and folding chairs and kids running barefoot through sprinklers. No forms, no fines, just people. That, to me, is what a neighborhood should be. My home is more than just a house. It always was. It's a promise, a legacy. And now, it's a symbol of what happens when ordinary people stand up to systems that try to break them. Sometimes folks stop by just to shake my hand. Strangers who read the story in the paper or saw the report on the news. They want to thank me for standing up, for not backing down, for showing that even when you're outnumbered, you're never powerless. I always tell them the same thing. I didn't do it alone. Justice might wear a robe and carry a gavel, but it walks on many feet. It grows in rose beds. It speaks in community potlucks and children's laughter. It endures not because of punishment, but because of people who refuse to be quiet. I kept one thing from Veronica, her coffee mug, the one she dropped the moment she realized who I really was. I keep it on my desk now, next to a small piece of scorched porch trim and a photo of my wife planting the first rosebush, years before HOA bylaws were even a thing. Sometimes, when I'm in court again, not as a judge, but as a witness or guest, I'll run my thumb along the handle of that mug. Just to remind myself, there's no justice without resistance, no peace without vigilance, no home without heart. And every morning, I sit here again, just like I used to, sipping coffee as the sun warms the porch. The wind carries the scent of blooming roses, and I breathe in something I almost lost once: freedom. In my quiet moments, sitting on this rebuilt porch with roses blooming again, I've come to understand something deeper than courtrooms or legal codes ever taught me. We don't just fight for property, we fight for dignity, for memory, for the right to live in peace without fear or control. The biggest lesson I've learned is this: silence enables bullies, but courage, especially quiet, steady courage, can dismantle even the most powerful lies. As we get older, it's tempting to retreat, to let the noise pass us by. But the truth is, wisdom and life experience are not just for reflection, they are tools. Tools to protect, to guide, to remind others what real community looks like. Standing up doesn't always mean shouting. Sometimes it means documenting, waiting, planting again after the fire, and above all, never letting anyone, no matter how polished or powerful, convince you that your worth depends on their approval. My home stood not just on stone and wood, but on love, tradition, and a quiet promise I made to my wife that I would protect what we built. And I did. So can you. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who might need the reminder. It's never too late to stand up and win.